The snow fell gently over Snowbridge, Vermont, wrapping the town in a blanket of pristine white. It was the kind of scene captured on postcards. Twinkling lights strung across rooftops, carolers bundled in scarves, and the sweet aroma of cinnamon wafting from the bakery on Main Street. But for Ethan Walsh, it was just another reminder of what he had lost. Ethan sat in his small workshop above his antique restoration shop, his hands expertly sanding the edge of a worn rocking chair. The rhythmic motion of his work was comforting, a distraction from the ache in his chest that never truly faded. 10 years had passed since the accident that took his wife and daughter, but the wound felt as raw as it had that first night when the world collapsed around him. Down below, the shop was quiet, as it often was. Business was steady but modest, and Ethan had no need for more than that. He avoided the bustling streets, the cheery crowds, and especially the festive events that seemed to consume the town this time of year. The holidays were a season he endured rather than celebrated. That evening, a knock at the door interrupted his solitude. He descended the narrow stairs to find a young delivery man, shivering in the cold and holding a slightly battered box. "Sorry, Mr. Walsh. Looks like this got delivered to the wrong place," the boy said, setting the box on the counter. Ethan nodded, murmured a thanks, and shut the door behind him. Back upstairs, Ethan examined the box. It was labeled in festive red ink, Snowbridge Community Post, Santa's Letters. He frowned, unsure of what to make of it. Inside, he found dozens of envelopes, each written in childish scrawl or shaky cursive. They were letters to Santa, part of the annual tradition where kids and families wrote their wishes for the season. The post office must have mixed up the addresses, and now these letters had landed on his doorstep. He set the box aside, fully intending to drop it off at the correct location the next morning. But later that night, unable to sleep, he found himself drawn back to it. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, compelled him to lift the lid. One by one, he read the wishes: a new bike, a dollhouse, a puppy. Simple, sweet requests from the town's children. Then, a particular letter caught his eye. It was written in blue crayon on lined notebook paper. The handwriting was uneven, but the words were clear. "Dear Santa, my name is Ruby, and I am 10 years old. This year, I don't want toys or clothes. I want my mom to be happy again. She cries a lot since my dad went to heaven, and I don't know how to help her. I wish I could make her smile like she used to. If you can, please bring us a miracle. Love, Ruby." Ethan's throat tightened as he read and reread the letter. The innocence in Ruby's plea was heartbreaking, her wish far more profound than the others. He set it aside and tried to move on, but the words lingered in his mind. He couldn't stop picturing Ruby, a little girl carrying a burden far too heavy for her age. The next morning, instead of heading directly to the post office, Ethan decided to take a detour. He walked through the quiet streets of Snowbridge, the cold air biting at his face. As he passed the shops, he spotted a small florist shop tucked between the bakery and the hardware store. The sign above the door read, "Amanda's Blooms." Peering through the frosted window, he saw a woman inside arranging a modest bouquet. She moved slowly, her shoulders hunched as though weighed down by something unseen. Behind her, a young girl, presumably Ruby, was busy organizing ribbons into neat piles. Her movements were quick, precise, as if she knew exactly what needed to be done and was determined to do it. Ethan lingered for a moment before turning away. Something about that brief glimpse tugged at him. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that had settled in his chest. By the time he returned to his workshop, Ruby's letter was sitting on his workbench, a quiet challenge he couldn't bring himself to ignore. Ethan sat at his workbench, staring at Ruby's letter. He had spent most of his life fixing things: furniture, clocks, heirlooms, but this was different. How could he possibly mend a broken heart, let alone bring happiness to a grieving mother? He shook his head, telling himself it wasn't his place to get involved. But as he tried to focus on restoring an old music box, the image of Ruby and her mother lingered in his mind, refusing to be silenced. The next day, he returned to Amanda's Blooms. He told himself he just wanted to look around, maybe buy a small bouquet for his workshop to brighten the space. Stepping inside, he was greeted by the scent of fresh pine and roses, a mix of winter and hope. Amanda was behind the counter, her movements efficient but devoid of enthusiasm. Ruby stood nearby, tying ribbons on small arrangements. "Can I help you with something?" Amanda asked, her voice polite but distant. "I was just looking," Ethan replied, glancing at the floral displays. His eyes wandered to a small shelf near the counter where a cracked vase sat, its vibrant blue pattern dulled by years of neglect. "That's a beautiful vase," he said, pointing to it. Amanda looked up, her expression softening slightly. "It belonged to my grandmother. It's been broken for years. I keep meaning to fix it, but fixing things is what I do," Ethan offered. "If you'd like, I can take a look at it." Amanda hesitated, her eyes flickering to Ruby, who was now watching the exchange intently. "I wouldn't want to trouble you." "No trouble at all," Ethan said. "I work just down the street. Bring it by any time." Amanda nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. Ruby beamed, as if sensing that this small moment of kindness carried more weight than her mother realized. The following afternoon, Amanda brought the vase to Ethan's shop. Ruby was with her, clutching a small box filled with the broken pieces. Ethan carefully examined the fragments, running his fingers over the jagged edges. "It's in good shape," he said. "I can restore it." Ruby's face lit up. "Really? It'll look brand new?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Not brand new, but close. Sometimes the cracks add character." Amanda seemed unsure how to respond, but she thanked him quietly before leaving. Ethan watched them go, feeling the familiar pull of isolation begin to shift. For the first time in years, he felt connected to someone, even if only through a shared sense of loss. Over the next few days, Ethan worked meticulously on the vase, carefully piecing it back together. The work was slow but satisfying, and he found himself thinking more about Amanda and Ruby. He noticed how Ruby's laughter had filled the shop, a bright contrast to her mother's quiet sadness. He wondered what it would take to help Amanda smile again. When the vase was finished, he delivered it himself, carefully wrapping it in tissue paper and carrying it to the florist's shop. Amanda and Ruby were both there, arranging a display of poinsettias near the window. When Amanda saw the vase, her eyes widened. "It's beautiful," she said softly, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "You've brought it back to life." Ruby grinned. "It's perfect. Thank you, Mr. Walsh." "Ethan," he corrected gently. "I'm glad you like it." Amanda hesitated, then said, "Would you like to join us for some tea?" "It's the least I can do." Ethan wanted to refuse out of habit, but something about Ruby's hopeful expression and Amanda's tentative warmth made him pause. "I'd like that," he said finally. They sat together in the small backroom of the shop, sipping tea from mismatched mugs. Ruby chatted excitedly about school and her favorite books, while Amanda listened quietly, occasionally chiming in. Ethan found himself relaxing, the tension in his shoulders easing as the conversation flowed. As the afternoon passed, Ethan learned more about their lives. Amanda had taken over the shop after her husband's death, but business had been slow. Ruby did her best to help, but the weight of responsibility often fell on Amanda's shoulders. Ethan shared a bit about his own work, avoiding mention of his past but feeling a sense of kinship with their struggles. When he left the shop that evening, the air felt lighter, as though a door had opened he hadn't realized was locked. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Over the next week, Ethan found excuses to stop by the shop. Sometimes he brought small repairs, a music box for Ruby, a reworked lamp for Amanda. Other times, he simply lingered, helping with arrangements or sharing a cup of tea. Slowly, a fragile bond began to form between them. Ruby, with her boundless curiosity, often peppered Ethan with questions about his work. She loved watching him restore old objects, marveling at how he brought beauty back to things others might have discarded. Amanda, though more reserved, began to smile more often, her guarded demeanor softening as she grew accustomed to Ethan's presence. One evening, as they sat together in the shop, Ruby asked Ethan a question that caught him off guard. "Do you have a family, Mr. Ethan?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, "I did. A long time ago." Ruby tilted her head, her bright eyes filled with compassion. "What happened?" Ethan glanced at Amanda, who was watching him closely, and took a deep breath. I lost them. In an accident. Ruby reached across the table and placed her small hand on his. I'm sorry. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Amanda's expression softened, and for a moment, they sat in silence, bound by an unspoken understanding. It was a fragile, bittersweet connection, but it was enough to remind Ethan that even the most broken things could be pieced back together. The days in Snowbridge grew colder, and the air filled with the anticipation of Christmas. Despite himself, Ethan found that his once-dreaded holiday season had become a little brighter. His visits to Amanda's shop became part of his routine, and Ruby's laughter often echoed in his thoughts long after he'd returned to his quiet apartment. Yet, something lingered beneath the surface, a restlessness that he couldn't quite shake. One evening, as Ethan worked in his shop, he came across a small box tucked away in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside was a collection of old photographs. He thumbed through them slowly, his chest tightening at the familiar faces of his wife and daughter. In one photo, his daughter, Claire, sat on his wife's lap beside a brightly decorated Christmas tree, her smile wide as she clutched a stuffed rabbit Ethan had repaired for her. Ethan set the photo down, his hands trembling. The memories came rushing back, vivid and painful. Christmas had once been a time of joy and love, but now it was a season of shadows. He closed the box and pushed it aside, unable to look further. The next day, he arrived at Amanda's shop with a sense of unease. Ruby greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, holding up a wreath she had made with golden pine cones and red ribbons. Look, Mr. Ethan, isn't it beautiful? Ethan smiled despite the heaviness in his chest. It's perfect, Ruby. You've got a real talent for this. Amanda appeared from the back, wiping her hands on an apron dusted with flour from their small baking project. She looked more at ease than when he'd first met her, though the traces of her grief still lingered. Ruby's been working on decorations all morning, she said with a hint of pride. She has more energy than I can keep up with. Ruby beamed. You should help us decorate, Mr. Ethan. We're making the shop look really Christmassy. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Amanda. I wouldn't want to intrude. You wouldn't be, Amanda said softly. We'd like to have you. For a moment, Ethan considered refusing, retreating back into his shell. But Ruby's hopeful expression and Amanda's quiet invitation softened his resolve. He nodded, rolling up his sleeves. All right, show me where to start. The next few hours passed in a blur of laughter and activity. Ruby instructed Ethan on where to hang ornaments and how to drape garlands just right, her excitement infectious. Amanda worked alongside them, her smiles coming more freely than before. Ethan found himself relaxing, the weight in his chest lifting as he immersed himself in the moment. As they finished, Ruby insisted on showing Ethan a special ornament, a delicate glass angel with golden wings. She held it carefully, her face serious. This was my dad's favorite, she said quietly. We always put it on the tree together. Ethan nodded, understanding the depth of what she was sharing. It's beautiful, Ruby. I'm sure your dad loved it. Ruby smiled, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Amanda placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt for being an outsider in such a personal moment. Yet, Ruby didn't seem to see him that way. She handed him the angel. Will you help me hang it? Ethan hesitated, the fragile ornament feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. Of course, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Together, they placed the angel at the top of a small tree Ruby had decorated. Amanda watched silently, her eyes brimming with tears, and Ethan realized that this simple act had bridged a gap between them all. Later that evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, Amanda stopped him at the door. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Ethan met her gaze, the sincerity in her voice striking a chord within him. I haven't done much. You've done more than you realize, she replied. For Ruby, and for me. Ethan nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As he walked back to his shop, the cold night air biting at his face, he felt a strange mix of warmth and unease. He couldn't deny the bond he was forming with Amanda and Ruby, but the memories of his own family weighed heavily on him, and the guilt of feeling connected to someone again was hard to ignore. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Amanda's shop grew busier as Christmas approached, and Ethan found himself volunteering to help with deliveries and repairs. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years, and though the ache of his loss was still present, it no longer consumed him entirely. But as the days grew shorter, Ethan began to notice something odd. A music box he had repaired for Ruby played a melody that tugged at his memory, though he couldn't quite place it. The design on the lid, intricate swirls of gold and red, felt strangely familiar. He brushed off the feeling at first, but the more time he spent with Amanda and Ruby, the more small details began to align in unsettling ways. One evening, as he sat in his shop, Ethan pulled out the box of photographs he had set aside earlier. He studied the images carefully, his heart pounding as he noticed a familiar object in one of the pictures. A vase with a blue pattern, identical to the one he had recently restored for Amanda. The realization hit him like a blow. He rummaged through his workbench, pulling out the broken pieces of the music box he had repaired. Examining them more closely, he found a faint engraving on the bottom. With love, Amanda and Tom. The world seemed to tilt around him as the pieces fell into place. The music box, the vase, the details of Ruby's letter. All of it pointed to one impossible truth. Amanda's late husband, Tom, had been connected to his own family in a way he hadn't understood until now. And the vase, with its history of love and loss, was the thread that tied them all together. Ethan sat back, his mind racing. The realization brought a flood of emotions: shock, anger, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of destiny. The connection was undeniable, but what it meant and how he could face Amanda with the truth was a question that loomed heavy in the air. He knew that his next steps would define not only his future but the fragile bond he had built with Amanda and Ruby. Ethan spent the rest of the night grappling with the discovery. The objects in his shop had always carried stories, pieces of other people's lives that he helped restore. But now, for the first time, he was part of the story, tangled in a web of connections he couldn't have foreseen. He couldn't shake the thought that his family and Amanda's had been linked long before he ever set foot in her shop. The implications were overwhelming. He stared at the music box, its soft melody playing in his mind even when the lid was closed. The engraving at the bottom was undeniable proof of Amanda's connection to his past. Tom, Amanda's late husband, had crafted the music box, the same one Ruby now cherished as a keepsake. Ethan's heart ached as he realized the music box must have once belonged to his daughter, Claire, somehow finding its way to Amanda's family after the accident. By morning, he still hadn't decided what to do. The truth felt like a fragile bomb, one that could shatter the trust he had built with Amanda and Ruby. But he also knew he couldn't keep it to himself forever. This wasn't just about him. It was about giving them the closure they didn't even realize they needed. When he arrived at Amanda's shop that day, the usual warmth of Ruby's greeting brought a bittersweet pang to his chest. She handed him a small mug of hot chocolate, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "You're just in time," she said brightly. "Mom and I are making wreaths for the town hall." Amanda appeared a moment later, smiling softly. "Good morning, Ethan. You look thoughtful." Ethan forced a smile. "Just a lot on my mind. Can I help with the wreaths?" Amanda nodded, leading him to a table in the back where ribbons and pine boughs were spread out. They worked side by side, the familiar rhythm of their tasks soothing in its simplicity. Ruby darted around them, chattering about school and the upcoming Christmas Eve celebration in the town square. Ethan listened quietly, but his thoughts remained heavy. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found himself glancing at Amanda more often, searching for the right moment to tell her. She seemed more at ease than he had ever seen her, her smiles coming more easily and her shoulders less weighed down by invisible burdens. Ruby's happiness had a way of spilling over onto her mother, and Ethan wondered if his revelation would undo all the progress they had made. When the shop grew quiet, Ethan finally spoke. "Amanda, can I talk to you for a moment?" She looked up, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Ethan hesitated, glancing toward Ruby, who was engrossed in decorating another wreath. "Maybe we could step outside for a bit." Amanda's expression shifted to one of concern, but but she followed him to the small alley behind the shop. The cold air was sharp, and their breaths misted in the space between them. Ethan rubbed his hands together, searching for the words. "I've been thinking a lot about how we met, about the things that brought me to your shop." Amanda tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "When I first started helping you and Ruby, I didn't think much about the connections between us. But over time, I've started noticing things, details about the objects you've brought to me, the stories behind them." Amanda's frown deepened. "Ethan, I don't understand." He pulled the music box from his bag, holding it out to her. "This music box, it belonged to my daughter. I'm certain of it. And the vase, the one I restored for you, was in my family for years before the accident." Amanda's eyes widened, and she stepped back slightly, her face pale. How is that possible?" Ethan's voice softened. "I don't know the exact details, but I think your husband, Tom, must have come into possession of some of my family's things after the accident. Maybe he found them at an auction or a secondhand shop. I don't blame him. He couldn't have known where they came from." Amanda's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the music box. "Tom always loved finding unique pieces. He would bring things home and tell me their stories. But I never thought—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked at Ethan with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think our lives have been connected in ways we didn't realize," Ethan said. "And because I feel like I owe you the truth. The accident that took my wife and daughter, it wasn't just any accident. Amanda, you were the other driver." Her face crumpled as the weight of his words sank in. She stumbled back, pressing a hand to her mouth. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No, that can't be true." Ethan stepped forward, his own emotions raw. "You didn't know." "I didn't know either, until I started piecing it all together. I'm not saying this to hurt you, Amanda. I needed to tell you." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "I've lived with the guilt of that accident for years. I always wondered who was in the other car, but I was too afraid to find out. And now, it's you." Ethan reached out, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I've spent a decade trying to bury my grief. Helping you and Ruby has been the first time I've felt like I could breathe again. I didn't plan for this to happen, but I think, maybe, it's what we both needed." Amanda's sobs softened, and she looked at him with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "I don't know how to process this, Ethan, but I'm glad you told me." They stood together in the cold, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy between them. Yet, in the silence, there was also an unspoken promise, a chance to heal together. Amanda didn't speak for a long time after Ethan's revelation. The weight of his words hung between them like the chill in the air, neither of them sure how to move forward. She stood still, clutching the music box as though it were the only thing grounding her in that moment. Ethan, uncertain of what to say next, simply waited. Finally, Amanda broke the silence. "I've spent so many nights replaying that accident in my mind. I thought about what I could have done differently, how I could have prevented it." Her voice cracked, and she wiped at her eyes with trembling hands. "And now, knowing it was your family, I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry, Ethan." He stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "I don't blame you, Amanda. I've had 10 years to carry this pain, and for most of that time, I didn't know who was on the other side of it either. I've been angry at the world, at fate, at myself. But meeting you and Ruby, it's changed things. It's made me see there's still a way to move forward." Amanda looked up at him, her eyes filled with both grief and something else, maybe hope. "I don't know if I deserve to move forward. Not after what happened." "You do," Ethan said firmly. "We both do. Holding on to the past hasn't helped me. It's only kept me stuck, and I don't want that anymore. Ruby doesn't deserve to see her mom carrying this burden forever. And neither do you." Amanda's shoulders sagged as she let out a shaky breath. "Ruby, she doesn't know anything about that night. I've never told her. She doesn't need to," Ethan said gently. "What she knows is that you love her and that you're doing your best every day. That's what matters to her." Amanda nodded, but her expression remained conflicted. "What happens now? How do we move forward from this? Ethan thought for a moment, searching for the right words. One step at a time. We don't have to have all the answers right now. But I believe that something brought us together. Maybe it's to heal what's broken in both of us. Maybe it's to help Ruby see the strength of her family, even through the hardest times. Amanda glanced down at the music box in her hands, her fingers tracing the delicate engraving. Tom would have wanted us to find peace, she said softly. He always believed in second chances, even when I didn't. Ethan nodded. Then let's give ourselves that chance. For Ruby. And for us. They stood together in the quiet alley for a while longer, the cold biting at their skin, but neither willing to break the fragile understanding that had formed between them. When they finally returned to the warmth of the shop, Ruby greeted them with a bright smile, oblivious to the heaviness of their conversation. Her innocence was a reminder of the hope that still lingered, even in the shadow of pain. In the days that followed, Ethan and Amanda began to navigate their new understanding with caution. They didn't discuss the accident again, but there was an unspoken agreement between them to focus on the present. Ethan continued to visit the shop, helping with repairs and deliveries, while Ruby reveled in the growing connection between her mother and the man she had come to adore. One afternoon, as they prepared for the town's Christmas Eve celebration, Ruby tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "You're coming with us to the square, right?" Ethan hesitated, his old resistance to holiday festivities bubbling to the surface. "I don't know, Ruby. I've never been much for big crowds." Ruby crossed her arms, her expression determined. "You have to come. It's tradition. Everyone in Snowbridge goes, and it's the best part of Christmas. Please." Amanda stepped in, her voice soft but persuasive. "It would mean a lot to Ruby. And to me." Ethan looked between them, his resolve wavering under the weight of their expectant gazes. Finally, he sighed. "All right, I'll come." Ruby cheered, throwing her arms around him, and Amanda's smile was enough to ease any lingering doubts. Ethan couldn't deny that, for the first time in years, the thought of being part of something didn't fill him with dread. On Christmas Eve, the town square was alive with lights and music. Families gathered around the towering Christmas tree in the center, its branches glittering with ornaments and strands of silver tinsel. The air was filled with the scent of pine and freshly baked cookies, and the sound of carolers singing classic holiday tunes. Ethan arrived with Amanda and Ruby, feeling out of place at first but quickly swept up in the warmth of the celebration. Ruby darted off to join her friends, leaving Ethan and Amanda standing together near the tree. "Thank you for coming," Amanda said, her voice sincere. "I know this isn't easy for you." Ethan shrugged, though his expression softened. "It's not as bad as I thought it would be. It's nice, actually." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the town came together in joy and celebration. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. The pain of his past was still there, but it felt quieter now, overshadowed by the light of the present. When the tree was lit and the crowd erupted in cheers, Ruby returned to their side, her face glowing with excitement. She slipped her hand into Ethan's, her small fingers wrapping around his. "This is the best Christmas ever," she said simply. Ethan looked at Amanda, who met his gaze with a smile that was no longer weighed down by sorrow. In that moment, he realized that the broken pieces of their lives were slowly being pieced back together, forming something new and beautiful. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the true spirit of Christmas, not in the lights or the music, but in the connections that had brought him back to life. It wasn't just about mending the past anymore. It was about embracing the future, one small miracle at a time. The warmth of the Christmas Eve celebration lingered in Ethan's mind as he returned to his shop that night. The town square had been a blur of laughter, music, and light, a far cry from the quiet solitude he'd once sought during the holidays. For the first time in years, he hadn't felt like an outsider looking in. He had been part of something, part of a family, if he dared to think of it that way. Still, as the hours passed and the streets outside grew silent, Ethan couldn't escape the weight of everything he had uncovered. Amanda's connection to his past felt like both a blessing and a burden. He had told her the truth, but he hadn't yet shared the deepest fear that gnawed at him, that his presence in her and Ruby's life might bring more harm than good. The following morning, Ethan arrived at Amanda's shop early, carrying a carefully wrapped package. Snowbridge was quiet in the soft light of Christmas morning, the snow sparkling under a pale winter sun. He hesitated at the door, wondering if he should turn back, but Ruby's cheerful voice inside gave him the courage to step in. "Mr. Ethan," Ruby called, running to greet him. She was still in her pajamas, her hair an untidy mess of curls. "Merry Christmas. Did Santa bring you anything?" Ethan chuckled, setting the package down on the counter. "Not this year, but I might have brought something for you." Ruby's eyes lit up, and she turned to her mother, who stood behind the counter arranging a small bouquet. "Can I open it, Mom?" "Please," Amanda smiled, her face more relaxed than Ethan had ever seen it. "Go ahead." Ruby tore into the package with the enthusiasm only a child could muster, revealing a beautifully restored wooden dollhouse. Her jaw dropped as she took in the delicate craftsmanship, the tiny shutters that opened and closed, the intricately painted flowers on the walls, and the miniature furniture inside. "It's perfect," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Ethan. "Thank you. It's just like the one I saw in that magazine." Ethan smiled, his chest tightening at her joy. "I thought you might like it. I found it in a storage auction a while back and figured it deserved a second chance." Ruby beamed, already placing imaginary occupants inside the tiny house. Amanda watched her daughter with a mixture of gratitude and emotion, then turned to Ethan. "You've done so much for us," she said softly. "More than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," Ethan replied. "Helping you and Ruby has been. It's been good for me, too." Amanda nodded, her eyes searching his. "I can see that, and I'm glad. But I still want you to know how much it means to us." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Ruby lose herself in her new treasure. The sight of her happiness was a balm for them both, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Yet, as much as Ethan wanted to focus on the present, the questions in his heart wouldn't leave him alone. Later that afternoon, as Ruby played in the back room, Ethan and Amanda sat together at the small table near the counter, sipping tea. The air between them was calm, but tinged with the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Amanda," Ethan began, setting his cup down, "there's something I've been thinking about. Something I need to ask." She looked at him, her expression curious but wary. "What is it?" "Do you think Ruby ever wonders about her dad?" he asked carefully. "I know she talks about him sometimes, but does she ask questions? Does she want to know more?" Amanda's face softened, and she let out a small sigh. "She does. She's asked about him more this year than ever before. I think she's trying to understand who he was, what he meant to me and to her." Ethan nodded slowly. "Do you ever talk to her about the accident? About how you've been feeling since then?" Amanda hesitated, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Not really. I've always tried to protect her from that part of it. I didn't want her to carry the weight of my grief. But maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I should have been more honest with her." "It's not easy," Ethan said quietly, "talking about the things that hurt the most. But I've learned that hiding from them doesn't make them go away. It just makes the silence heavier." Amanda looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "You're right. I don't want to keep her in the dark anymore. She deserves to know the truth, at least as much as she can understand." Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "You don't have to do it alone. If you need me there, I'll be with you." Her eyes glistened, and she gave him a small, trembling smile. "Thank you, Ethan. I think I might take you up on that." That evening, as the sun set over Snowbridge and the town settled into the peaceful stillness of Christmas night, Amanda gathered Ruby in the living room of their small apartment. Ethan sat nearby, his presence a quiet source of comfort. "Ruby," Amanda began gently, "there's something I want to talk to you about. Something about your dad." Ruby looked up, her eyes wide and curious. "What is it, Mom?" Amanda took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Ethan before continuing. "Your dad was a wonderful man. He loved us so much, and he was always looking for ways to make people happy. But there are things about his life, and about what happened, that I haven't shared with you before." As Amanda began to speak, She told Ruby about the accident, carefully choosing her words to shield her from the most painful details while still being honest. Ruby listened intently, her small hands clutching the arm of the couch. Ethan watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy but hopeful. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where honesty and love could begin to heal the wounds of the past. And though the journey ahead would not be easy, he knew that together they could face it. Ruby sat quietly, processing her mother's words. Amanda's voice trembled at times, but she spoke with a clarity and warmth that made it clear how much she wanted Ruby to understand. Ethan stayed in the background, offering silent support as Amanda shared parts of the story she had kept buried for so long. When Amanda finished, Ruby's gaze dropped to her lap. "So, Dad didn't come home because of the accident," she said softly, her small hands twisting the hem of her sweater. Amanda nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "Yes, sweetheart. It was a terrible accident, but your dad loved you so much. He was so proud of you, and he would want you to know that." Ruby looked up, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. "It wasn't anyone's fault, right? It just happened." Amanda's voice broke as she answered, "That's right. Sometimes things happen that we can't control, no matter how much we wish we could." Ruby reached for her mother's hand, her grip firm. "I miss him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't remember him very well, but I miss him." Amanda pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, her tears spilling freely now. "I miss him too, Ruby. Every day. But having you reminds me of the best parts of him. And I know he'd be so proud of how strong and kind you are." Ethan stayed silent, watching the two of them find solace in each other. It was a deeply personal moment, and he felt honored to witness it. Yet, a pang of guilt lingered in his chest. He hadn't shared the full extent of his connection to their story, and though he knew it wasn't the time, the knowledge weighed heavily on him. After a few moments, Ruby pulled back from her mother's arms and turned to Ethan. "Did you know my dad?" she asked, her voice hesitant but curious. The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "Not really," he admitted carefully, "but I've learned a lot about him through you and your mom. He seemed like a wonderful person." Ruby tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying him. "Is that why you want to help us? Because of Dad?" Ethan felt Amanda's gaze on him as well, her expression unreadable. He nodded slowly, choosing his words with care. "In a way, yes. I think your dad and I would have had a lot in common. I think he'd want someone to look out for you and your mom." Ruby seemed satisfied with his answer, and she offered him a small, thoughtful smile. "I think you're right. He would have liked you." Amanda didn't say anything, but the warmth in her eyes told Ethan she understood the weight of what he was holding back. For now, she let it rest, knowing there would be time to explore the deeper truth later. The following days were quiet, but marked by a sense of renewal. Amanda seemed lighter, her steps less burdened by the invisible weight she had carried for so long. Ruby, too, appeared more at ease, her natural exuberance shining brighter now that some of the questions about her father had been answered. Ethan continued to spend time with them, finding peace in their company and purpose in the small ways he could help. One afternoon, as Ruby played with her dollhouse in the shop, Amanda and Ethan worked together to arrange a display of winter flowers. The air between them was comfortable, their unspoken understanding growing stronger with each passing day. "I've been thinking," Amanda said suddenly, breaking the silence, "about everything you've done for us." "For Ruby." Ethan looked at her, unsure where she was going. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "It's been good for me too." "I know," Amanda replied, her voice soft, "but I mean it. You've brought something back into our lives that I thought was gone forever. Joy, hope. It's more than I could have asked for." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "You and Ruby have done the same for me," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd ever feel connected to anyone again. But you've shown me that it's possible." Amanda met his gaze, her expression serious but kind. "I don't know what the future holds, Ethan, but I do know that I'm glad you walked into our lives. I'm glad you stayed." Ethan wanted to respond, to tell her how much her words meant to him, but the sound of Ruby's voice interrupted the moment. "Mom, Mr. Ethan, come see," Ruby called, her excitement palpable. They turned to find her pointing to the dollhouse. She had set up a small Christmas scene inside, complete with tiny decorations and a handmade tree she had crafted from green pipe cleaners. "It's just like our house," Ruby said proudly. "Only smaller." Amanda laughed, wiping her hands on her apron as she bent to admire Ruby's work. Ethan knelt beside them, marveling at the care Ruby had put into the tiny details. The scene was a reflection of the warmth and love that had slowly returned to their lives, and it filled him with a sense of quiet gratitude. As they sat together, Ruby reached for Ethan's hand. "You're part of our family now," she declared confidently. "Right, Mom?" Amanda glanced at Ethan, her eyes softening. "What do you think, Ethan? Are you ready to be part of this crazy little family?" Ethan's heart swelled at the question, the walls he had built around himself finally giving way. He smiled, his voice steady and full of certainty. "I'd be honored." Ruby threw her arms around him, and Amanda joined in, their embrace a symbol of the new bond they had formed. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly whole, the fractures in his heart no longer defining him but adding to the strength he had found in this unexpected journey. Christmas, he realized, was not about perfection or the absence of pain. It was about the people who stayed, who shared the broken pieces, and who helped rebuild something beautiful together. The days after Christmas settled into a peaceful rhythm in Snowbridge. The holiday rush was over, leaving the streets quieter but still adorned with twinkling lights and wreaths on every door. Ethan found himself drawn even closer to Amanda and Ruby, spending most of his days at their shop or working on small projects Ruby came up with, like restoring tiny pieces for her dollhouse or fixing old ornaments they'd uncovered in Amanda's attic. For Amanda, life felt different now, less heavy, less burdened by the weight of unspoken pain. Ethan's presence had become a steady source of comfort, and though she hadn't fully processed everything he'd revealed, she felt grateful for the way he had gently worked his way into their lives. Ruby, always perceptive, seemed to sense the growing bond between her mother and Ethan, and she embraced it wholeheartedly, seeing him as the missing piece they hadn't realized they needed. One snowy afternoon, as the three of them shared a quiet lunch in the shop, Ruby brought up a question that had been lingering in her mind. "Mom," she began, pushing a piece of bread around her plate, "do you think Dad would have liked Mr. Ethan?" Amanda paused, glancing at Ethan, who froze mid-bite. The question was simple, but carried a weight neither adult had expected. Amanda reached out and tucked a stray curl behind Ruby's ear. "I think your dad would have liked anyone who made us happy," she said softly. "And Ethan has done that, hasn't he?" Ruby nodded vigorously, her eyes lighting up. "He has. It's like he fixes more than just old things. He fixes people too." Ethan felt his throat tighten. Ruby's words struck a chord he hadn't expected, and he didn't know how to respond. Amanda reached over and placed her hand lightly on his, grounding him. "You do, you know," she said. "You've brought us back to life, Ethan." He swallowed hard, nodding but unable to speak. The truth was, they had done the same for him. For so long, he'd lived in the shadow of his grief, letting it define him, letting it keep him isolated. Amanda and Ruby had shattered that shell, and though it was uncomfortable at times, he wouldn't trade the vulnerability for anything. That night, Ethan returned to his apartment and sat alone in his workshop. He turned on the old radio, letting the soft hum of classical music fill the space as he worked. But his mind kept drifting back to Amanda's words and Ruby's innocent, perceptive comment about fixing people. He looked around at the pieces of furniture and trinkets scattered across his shop, all waiting for restoration. Each one had a story, a history that deserved to be preserved. It was something he had always taken pride in, but now he wondered if his skill was more than just craftsmanship. Maybe it was a way of connecting to the world, of piecing together what had been broken, not just in objects but in people too. He thought about the music box, the dollhouse, the vase, all the things that had brought him closer to Amanda and Ruby. He thought about the accident, the pain it had caused, and the strange, almost miraculous way their lives had intertwined. It still felt surreal at times, as though the universe had chosen this path for them, nudging them toward one another until they could no longer ignore it. As the snow fell softly outside his window, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't just going to be a part of their lives in the background. He wanted to be present, fully and completely, even if it meant confronting his own fears and vulnerabilities. He didn't want to hide from his feelings anymore, or from the potential of something beautiful. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future, a real one, with Amanda and Ruby by his side. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the shop early, carrying a small wooden box he had spent the night crafting. Amanda was in the back, arranging flowers for an upcoming event, while Ruby sat at the counter, coloring in a new set of sketches she had drawn for her dollhouse. "What's that?" Ruby asked, her curiosity piqued. Ethan set the box down carefully and opened it to reveal a delicate ornament, a small wooden heart, intricately carved with swirling patterns and painted in soft reds and golds. "It's for you and your mom," Ethan said. "I thought you might like something special for next Christmas." Ruby's eyes widened as she picked up the ornament, turning it over in her hands. "It's so pretty. Did you make it?" Ethan nodded, his smile soft. "I did. I wanted it to be something that reminded you of how far you've come, of how strong you both are." Ruby grinned and ran to show Amanda, who emerged from the back with a bouquet of white roses in her arms. She took one look at the ornament and smiled, her eyes misting over. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Ethan." He shrugged, trying to downplay the significance of the gesture, but Amanda stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. "You really have a gift," she said, "not just for making things, but for understanding what people need. You've given us more than I ever thought possible." Ethan met her eyes, his heart pounding. "You've done the same for me, Amanda. I don't think I realized how much I needed this. Needed you and Ruby, until you were already part of my life." Amanda smiled, her hand brushing lightly against his. "Then maybe we were meant to find each other. Maybe this is where we're supposed to be." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "I think so." The moment was interrupted by Ruby, who returned with a box of ornaments she'd found in the storage closet. "Can we put this one on the tree now?" she asked, holding up the wooden heart. Amanda laughed, shaking her head. "We can wait until next year, sweetheart. But we'll keep it somewhere special until then." Ruby pouted for a moment before her smile returned. "Okay, but it's going right at the top next year." Ethan chuckled, watching as Ruby carefully placed the ornament back in its box. He felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of purpose. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It was about building something new, something whole, with the people who had given him a second chance at life. As the day went on, Ethan found himself more at peace than he had been in a decade. The future still felt uncertain, but it was no longer something to fear. With Amanda and Ruby, he knew he had found not just a family, but a reason to believe in miracles again. And as the snow continued to fall over Snowbridge, blanketing the town in quiet beauty, Ethan allowed himself to embrace the hope that had been waiting for him all along. Ethan stood at the counter in Amanda's shop, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the small wooden box he had brought in earlier. Ruby had carefully tucked the ornament away, her excitement still evident as she buzzed around the shop, tidying things that didn't need tidying. Amanda worked quietly nearby, her movements smooth and deliberate as she arranged a new display of winter blooms. The shop smelled of pine and fresh roses, and the warmth inside was a stark contrast to the snowstorms swirling outside. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment, though it was tinged with an undercurrent of unease. He had found a place with Amanda and Ruby, but the deeper truths of their intertwined past still hung between him and Amanda. They had begun to move forward, yet he knew the full weight of their connection, of the accident that had changed all their lives, hadn't been fully addressed. As Amanda finished her arrangement, she looked up at Ethan, her expression soft but curious. "You're quiet today," she said. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about second chances and finding where we're supposed to be." Amanda tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "And I think you're right," Ethan said slowly. "I think we've been given a second chance, but I also think there's more I need to tell you, more I need to share." Amanda set down the vase she had been holding and walked around the counter, her brow furrowing. "Ethan, what is it? You're scaring me." He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "When I told you about the accident, I didn't tell you everything. I didn't tell you about the way our lives were connected even before that night." Amanda's face went pale, but she stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was worn at the edges, but the image was still clear. His wife and daughter sitting beside the very same vase he had restored for Amanda months ago. He handed it to her, watching as her eyes scanned the photo, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition. "That vase," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the same one." Ethan nodded. "It was in my family for years. It belonged to my wife's grandmother. After the accident, I assume it was sold at an estate sale or an auction. Somehow, it found its way to Tom." Amanda's hands trembled as she held the photograph. Tom loved finding things like this. He always said objects carried stories, and he wanted to be part of them. "But I never knew. I never realized where this came from." "There's more," Ethan said gently. He pulled out the music box, the one Ruby now treasured. "This was my daughter's. It was in the car that night. I don't know how it ended up in your family, but I think Tom must have found it the same way he found the vase." Amanda stared at the music box, tears welling in her eyes. "I remember when he brought this home. He said it was special, that it had a history he wanted to honor. I never questioned it. I loved the way it made Ruby happy." Ethan placed the music box on the counter, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "That's what I've been trying to tell you, Amanda. Our lives have been connected in ways we couldn't have imagined. The accident, the objects, even Ruby, they've all brought us here. And I think there's a reason for that." Amanda wiped at her eyes, her breath hitching as she tried to process everything. "I don't know what to say, Ethan. It's all so much. How do we move forward knowing this?" "We move forward the same way we have been," Ethan said, "by focusing on what's in front of us, on what we've built together. I don't think this is about holding on to the pain of the past. I think it's about finding a way to heal." Amanda looked at him, her gaze steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You've already started to heal us, Ethan. Ruby and I. We were lost before you came into our lives. I don't know how to thank you for that." Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You and Ruby have given me just as much. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm part of something again. Like I have a purpose." Amanda stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You are part of something. You're part of us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan felt the weight of them settle in his chest, not as a burden, but as a promise. He nodded, his voice quiet. "I'd like to keep being part of that. If you'll have me." Amanda smiled through her tears, her hand tightening on his arm. "We'd be lucky to have you." The sound of Ruby's laughter broke the moment, and they turned to see her holding the wooden heart ornament Ethan had made. She held it up triumphantly. "I found the perfect spot for it," she announced, running to the small tree in the corner of the shop and hanging it carefully on a branch. Ethan and Amanda watched her, their shared pain momentarily eclipsed by the simple joy of Ruby's enthusiasm. It was a reminder of why they had come together, of what they had gained despite everything they had lost. As the afternoon faded into evening, the three of them sat together in the shop, the soft glow of the Christmas lights casting a warm, golden hue over the room. Ruby chattered about her plans for the dollhouse, her excitement filling the space with life. Amanda and Ethan listened, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for cups of tea or adjusted the decorations Ruby had insisted needed more sparkle. For the first time, Ethan felt at peace, not because the past no longer mattered, but because he had found a way to carry it without letting it define him. Amanda and Ruby had become his family, not through blood or obligation, but through love and the shared understanding of what it meant to start again. As the snow continued to fall outside, Ethan allowed himself to believe in the magic of new beginnings. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The days following Ethan's revelation felt lighter, as though the weight that had hung over Amanda and him had begun to lift. They didn't dwell on the painful details of their shared past, but acknowledged it as part of the story that had brought them together. Ruby, blissfully unaware of the deeper layers of what had transpired, continued to brighten their days with her boundless energy and enthusiasm. Ethan found himself spending more and more time at Amanda's shop, not just helping with tasks, but simply being present. He would sit with Ruby as she worked on her dollhouse or lend a hand with Amanda's floral arrangements. They became a quiet team, a family in every way that mattered, and for Ethan, the once dreaded holidays became a season of belonging. One snowy afternoon, as the three of them decorated cookies at Amanda's apartment, Ruby spoke up with her usual cheerful curiosity. "Do you think Dad would have liked it here, with all of us?" she asked, carefully applying too much frosting to a gingerbread man. Amanda smiled gently, her hands pausing over a tray of cookies. "I think he would have loved it. He always liked when our home was filled with people and laughter." Ruby turned to Ethan, her wide eyes earnest. "What about you, Mr. Ethan? Do you think my dad would have liked you?" Ethan hesitated, the question pulling at something deep inside him. He set down the cookie he'd been decorating and looked at Ruby. "I hope so," he said honestly. "I'd like to think he'd be happy that I'm here to help take care of you and your mom." Ruby nodded solemnly, as though weighing his answer. Then she broke into a grin and reached out to smear frosting on Ethan's cheek. "I think he'd think you're pretty funny." Amanda laughed, the sound warm and full, and Ethan joined in, wiping the frosting off with a mock scowl. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated joy. As the evening stretched on, Amanda lit a fire in the small living room, and the three of them sat together, sipping hot cocoa and watching the flames dance. Ruby dozed off against Ethan's side, her small hand clutching his sleeve, and Amanda smiled softly at the sight. "You're good with her," she said, her voice low so as not to wake Ruby. "She trusts you in a way she doesn't trust many people." Ethan looked down at the sleeping girl, his heart swelling. "She's an incredible kid, and that's because of you." Amanda shook her head. "It hasn't been easy, raising her alone. I've tried my best, but there were times I didn't know if it was enough." "It was," Ethan said firmly. "She's strong, kind, and resilient, just like her mom." Amanda's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, her eyes glistening. "I didn't think I could do this on my own, but now, it doesn't feel like I'm alone anymore." "You're not," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And you never have to be again." The words hung between them, unspoken feelings weaving their way through the quiet. Amanda met his gaze, her expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper. Ethan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Ethan smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me, Amanda. You and Ruby. You've given me more than I ever thought I could have again." As the fire crackled and the snow fell outside, they sat together in a silence that spoke volumes. The bond they had built felt unshakable, and for the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future filled with love and hope. The next morning, Ruby woke with an idea that had her bursting into the kitchen where Ethan and Amanda were having coffee. "We should have a party," she declared, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "A party?" Amanda asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, like a New Year's party. We can invite everyone. Mr. Ethan's friends, our neighbors, people from the shop." Ruby's enthusiasm was infectious, and Amanda couldn't help but laugh. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Ethan said, smiling at Ruby. "We could start the new year surrounded by everyone who's important to us." Amanda hesitated, the thought of opening her home to so many people feeling a bit overwhelming. But as she looked at Ruby's hopeful face and Ethan's steady encouragement, she found herself nodding. "All right, let's do it." The days leading up to New Year's were filled with preparations. Amanda and Ruby decorated the apartment with twinkling lights and streamers, while Ethan helped organize food and drinks. Invitations were sent out to friends, neighbors, and customers from the shop, and soon the little apartment was buzzing with anticipation. On New Year's Eve, as guests began to arrive, Amanda marveled at how full and vibrant her home felt. Laughter echoed through the rooms, and the scent of food and mulled cider filled the air. Ruby flitted from group to group, proudly showing off her dollhouse and introducing Ethan as our very best friend. As the clock neared midnight, Amanda found herself standing next to Ethan by the window, watching the snow fall outside. "This is more than I ever imagined," she said softly. "I never thought our lives could feel this whole again." Ethan turned to her, his expression gentle. "You've built something beautiful, Amanda, and I'm grateful to be part of it." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You're more than just a part of it, Ethan. You've helped make it possible." The sound of Ruby's voice interrupted them. "It's almost time," she called, pulling them toward the living room where everyone had gathered around the clock. As the countdown began, Ethan felt Amanda's hand slip into his, her fingers lacing through his own. It was a simple gesture, but it carried with it a promise, one of love, trust, and a shared future. When the clock struck midnight and the room erupted in cheers, Ethan looked at Amanda and Ruby, his heart full. This wasn't the life he had imagined years ago, but it was better. It was real, imperfect, and filled with the kind of love that could weather any storm. As the new year began, Ethan knew that the broken pieces of his past had finally found their place, creating something whole and beautiful. And for the first time in a decade, he looked forward to the future, not with fear, but with hope.